All right, welcome back. This is our first lesson post of Mice and Men. So if you are watching this and you haven't finished a reading of Mice and Men, which of course you can just listen, hopefully you're listening and following along. Hopefully you know the full end, but if you haven't done the whole book yet, you need to finish the book before we do this so that you know what we're talking about. So today's lesson is focused on kind of wrapping it up and moving us into something new for later. But before we do that, as usual, let's talk about what's at least making me happy. Of course, you can always email me and tell me what's making you happy as we get deeper and deeper into this, social isolation, social distancing thing. Today, what's making me happy is the fact that my brother and his wife had a baby over the weekend, and everybody's safe and healthy, and they're super excited because they have a perfect excuse to not share the baby with anybody and get to spend a whole bunch of time at home, um, just getting to know the baby and making sure that their 3-year-old is, learning how to take care of the baby and all of that for months and months and months and no visitors. So, of course, we've done some FaceTime and things like that. But yeah, that was a spot of bright news in a kind of a gross week otherwise. And I hope that there are things that are making you happy as well. Uh, Also, I hope that you are staying healthy and safe and sane over the course of what is, you know, getting getting a little rough, I think, at least for me. I mean, just not being able to see and hang out with people, including you guys. So let's move on to what we are going to be talking about today. We're going to take all of what we read in Of Mice and Men, and we're going to start applying it to um, this idea of perspective or point of view. So what I want to do is start by asking ourselves this question: why did John Steinbeck, the author of Mice and Men, tell the story the way that he told the story? And this is going to be, I'm not just asking this because, oh, what an interesting thing to ask. I'm asking this because this is going to help us with the writing activity that we're going to do tomorrow. And also it's going to lead us to something bigger and maybe even more exciting that we're going to do after spring break. So considering the point of view of a story is really important because depending on the point of view of the story can take on a really kind of different meaning for us. So John Steinbeck wrote Of Mice and Men in what we call the third person omniscient point of view. And I've provided this picture here in the middle to kind of emphasize what the third person omniscient point of view is. It's basically you're on the outside and you're looking in at the characters. And so in this picture, we've got, this little shot of the countryside. There's the windmill and the house. We might assume that that's Lenny and George's kind of dream place maybe or something like that. But we're looking at it from afar. And this is, excuse me, this is the third person omniscient point of view, at least a visual representation of the third person omniscient point of view. So what I have are 5 different ways of understanding the third person omniscient point of view, and I'll uncover those one by one. It would not be a bad idea for you guys to take some notes on this stuff so that you remember it. You can always, of course, come back to this video and rewatch it and remind yourself, but having it written down may actually be more helpful for you, especially for the things that we're going to do in the future so that you don't have to keep coming back and rewatching the video if you don't want to. Of course, I'm not going to put everything on the screen that I'm going to say, so taking notes will also allow you to add certain pieces of information that may help you with future assignments. So let's start. One way that we can talk about the third person omniscient point of view is that it's a detached point of view. It's a big picture point of view. It allows us to see everything as without judgment, basically. So we can just look at a picture and we can take the whole thing in, and it's all kind of up to us to absorb all of the information. What I mean by detached is that the author isn't necessarily passing judgment on it so much as just kind of presenting the thing as it is. Like here's the picture, you take it in, you absorb it, you understand it on your own terms. The second way that we can understand the third person omniscient point of view is something that I was just alluding to in the previous one, is that there's no judgment of the character's speech or actions. So when a character says something or does something, normally what happens in a third person omniscient point of view is that it's just described. It just says this character did this thing or this character said this thing. It may color it just a little bit. It may give us kind of a sense, did this thing violently or did this thing carefully or said this thing quietly. But for the most part, it's just describing the way a character is doing something. It's left to us to determine how we feel about that character and what they're doing or what they're saying, and why we feel that way. So it really allows us to detach from maybe what the characters are how the characters would describe how they were feeling at that moment. We have to figure out how the characters were feeling or why the characters did a certain thing. They're not explaining it to us. And so our judgment comes into play, but we're not judging based on what the author is telling us. The third thing that the third person omniscient point of view does is that it allows the author to focus on any big picture detail that they want. If there's something that they want you to understand, they can describe it. They're not limited by maybe what a character would have noticed, right? So the author, by telling this in third person, by telling a story in third person, and by omniscient means knowing everything, means that if they want you to know that while Lenny and George are having a conversation, that there's a snake slithering through a pool, then the author can tell you that because the author knows everything. Whereas Lenny and George may not have been aware of the fact that there was a snake slithering through the pool. If the author thinks that it's important for you to know that there's a snake slithering through the pool, then the author can tell you that. And so that's something that third person omniscient point of view allows from its perspective. The fourth thing that I want you to know about the third person omniscient point of view is that it allows us to view the situation and the author potentially to view the situation without bias, which means that it goes back to this lack of judgment, that we're not judging the character's speech or the character's actions, or we're not getting the judgment. Other characters are not coloring our judgment of character speech or character actions. The author is able to present what's happening in the story without bias, and the only bias that we are then presented with is our own. We are allowed to bring our own judgments to the characters, to the situation, to the setting, based on the information that we're given by the author. And so we start with no bias, and then we apply our own judgments to the situation. Finally, for third person point of view, we then, and this is what I was building to with the last one, it allows us as the reader to make up our own minds, right? To pass our own judgments on the situation. We're just given the information. These characters did these things. These things happened while the characters were talking. You know, uh, this allows us to then put the whole story together from our own perspective and make up our own mind. Was it right for this thing to happen? Was it wrong for this thing to happen? Is this a good or a bad action? You know, all of that is up to us to determine when the third person omniscient point of view is being used, which is nice because then we're able to discuss with other people, well, did you think that George should have done this thing? Or did you think that it was right for them to, you know, to put the dog down or anything like that? Third person omniscient point of view just has presented us with these situations, and we are then allowed to have those discussions as you did in yesterday's discussion board. Now, the other point of view, well, there's actually second person. We're not going to cover second person. But the other point of view that I want to bring up is the point of view of first person limited. So we would go from third person omniscient, meaning knowing everything, being able to describe anything you want, from third person, to first person limited, which means that it's told from a character's perspective, that the character is saying I, and you know, I did this, or I said that, whatever, and it's limited to what the character knows or what the character is able to perceive, rather than knowing everything. So you can see how the picture has shifted from this kind of big picture, you know, to now we're looking, it seems as though we're looking through somebody else's eyes. And that's the point. First person is looking from somebody else's point of view, and it's limited to what they notice. So let's look at the 5 descriptors of third person and compare them to 5 descriptors of first person. So first of all, first person limited is dependent upon what the character is telling us. It's a little picture story. So if Of Mice and Men had been told from Lenny's perspective, or George's perspective, or Slim's perspective, we would have gotten a completely different story because it would have been limited to only the things that that character experienced. We wouldn't have been allowed to know certain things that the third person version of the story that we read allowed us to know. Another description is that the character filters and judges the situation through their own perspective, right? So whereas in third person, there's no judgment coming in from the characters. It's just the author telling us the character did this, or the character said that. To now, when it's first person, we are constantly being told what the characters say and do through the perspective of this single narrator. Think of when you tell a story. You're going to tell that story, if it's from your perspective, you're going to tell it with your own judgments, right? Like, oh, this person was so mean to me when they said this particular line. Well, maybe somebody else wouldn't have perceived it as mean, but you are filtering that perspective, that thing that they said through your own perspective, and it makes it, it puts your judgment on the situation. The third descriptor is that the perception of the character limits what the character is able to describe, and limits the voice of the character, right? So where I use the example, you know, if in third person, Lenny and George are sitting at the, you know, at the river, and they're having a conversation, and a snake glides through the river, but they don't notice it. Well, if that conversation was being told first person through George's point of view, and George didn't see that snake, that detail is no longer capable of being included in the story. We just missed that detail, whether it was important or not, or whether it was interesting or not. George doesn't know it. It can't be included. It also means that George's voice has to constantly be used, right? So we can only hear the description from George's in a way that George would describe it. Whereas in third person, the author could describe it any way they choose to describe it. So that voice is really important too. It has to sound like the person who's speaking and telling the story. The fourth descriptor is that the situation is biased by the character's perspective, whereas with third person omniscient, the author is able to just present the story and present the ideas in a way that is hopefully unbiased, means not passing judgment. In this case, because of the characters' limitations and because of their voice and because of their perspective on the situation, you're constantly going to be given these situations in a way that we only get this character's perspective on the situation. If George thinks that it's wrong for somebody to treat Lenny in a certain way, then we're only going to get that perspective if George is the person telling the story. Whereas if George isn't telling the story, if it's third person, it's our judgment to determine whether we think the way that people are treating Lenny is wrong or not. So we have to notice that when anything is being told from first person limited, we are being presented only that character's biased perspective, and that there are probably other ways of understanding it, that understanding character actions and character and other pieces of the story that we just aren't being exposed to. Lastly, the fifth descriptor is that the reader's opinions about the situation are limited by the character's choices, right? So we, with third person, are allowed to make up our minds because we're being presented with potentially all of the important information, and as unbiased a point of view as possible. Whereas in the first person limited, that the character who's telling the story with their voice and with their limited descriptions and with their perspectives and their biases are really limiting our ability to understand the story. And so we're kind of forced to understand the story from their perspective, and we don't get a full picture of what's going on. And so we tend to kind of usually agree with the way that the character is telling the story and not understand that maybe another character would tell the story from a completely different point of view and with different ideas and maybe disagreeing ideas from that character. Whereas with third person, we can decide, well, I like the way that this character is acting, but I don't like that character. We don't really get that option with first person. We're just kind of held captive by one character. So why is this important? Well, because Of Mice and Men has some tricky concepts in it, right? So with Of Mice and Men, we wonder, like, should George have done what he did? If it was told from George's perspective, maybe we would say, yeah, he did the right thing. He would be, we would be biased by George's perspective, you know. Whereas from third person, we're able to kind of argue, well, maybe he did it because of this, or maybe he did it because of that. Maybe it was good, maybe it wasn't good, and all those kinds of things. And so it's an interesting exercise to go through and just kind of say, like, how would the story have changed if the perspective of the story, if the point of view of the story had been different? What would happen if we told the entire story from Slim's point of view? We would miss a whole bunch of details, first of all. We would miss a whole bunch of the story. But second of all, we probably would find ourselves kind of biased in a way that maybe we aren't biased now. So that's going to be the nature of tomorrow's writing exercise, where I'm going to ask you to say, okay, now that we've kind of understood the story and we've decided for ourselves how we interpret and judge the story, how might this story be different, or how might I try to understand the story from a different perspective if I were to tell the story from the perspective of, say, George, or from the perspective of Candy, or from the perspective of Slim. So what I want you to look forward to in tomorrow's lesson is that this will be a creative writing activity, which I think is kind of exciting because we don't get to do a lot of creative writing. We do a lot of academic, kind of boring paragraph writing, provide evidence, yada, yada, yada. But tomorrow's activity should be an opportunity to say, like, look, this is a chance for me to really break out and do something a little bit more fun and explore Of Mice and Men in a way that's different than we have explored some of the other texts this year. So I hope you're kind of looking forward to that. I look forward to what you guys can come up with tomorrow. I hope you guys got some good notes. If you do have questions, please email me because, of course, it's difficult to convey certain concepts, digitally. So please do email me if you need me to clarify something for you.